afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are joining us. My name is Eric Kalachik. I'm the director of the Hariri Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the last component of our AI and Inequalities Creating Change speaker series, where we have a series panel for you. The Hariri Institute for Computing and BU is dedicated to initiating research convergence and accelerating integrated initiatives with social impact at the nexus of the computational and data sciences through its many centers and initiatives. This distinguished speaker series is a new one this year, which we're really delighted to be able to offer you. Before we move on with today's event, I want to just put a bug in people's ear for our next one. So we do 2 of these a year where we cluster speakers around a theme, have them each speak, and then have them all rejoin us for a panel. So upcoming in late spring will be a second speaker series for this year on machine learning for model-rich problems, where we'll have people joining us from astrophysics, biophysics, economics, and structural design to talk about the interface of machine learning and theory-driven modeling. So please keep an eye out for that and join us if you can. All right, so now transitioning to today's event. Over the last few weeks, we brought together these 3 speakers at the forefront of creating change. We had Sabelo, Mhlambi, Timnit, Gebru, and Meredith Whittaker. They've each spoken individually about ways in which we're making inroads against AI bias towards a more fair, ethical, and democratized AI landscape. We're happy to bring them together now again. The panel session is going to be informed by a handful of questions, which were in turn informed by many of the questions that you either left with us in the previous talks or sent to us through the Eventbrite registration form. So we thank you all very much for that. Right. I want to offer a few reflections to set context if you weren't able to join us previously. We clearly have heard we're in a period of unparalleled growth and development around AI, not only in the core technologies, but especially relevant here in the extent and the manner in which it's being adopted around us. But we've heard that the rate at which AI is being adopted has seemed to vastly outstrip our preparedness, right? Our preparedness for monitoring and assessment of the impact, for regulation, and even most fundamentally, our preparedness for inclusive and informed discussion. I would say central to what we've heard from all 3 speakers in this series is a message of how critical it is that we look beyond the sort of deceptively reassuring notions that the challenge is primarily technical, with the implication being that we just need technical solutions. And instead, in each of their talks, our speakers have offered a variety of additional elements or dimensions towards a necessarily more comprehensive approach. And they've been urging us, and in fact showing us, how to incorporate dimensions of accountability, advocacy, equity, governance, law, and philosophy, among others. And finally, I think we've heard emphatically that time is short, right? The increasingly broad deployment of AI in its present form, in the present manner, is at a minimum supporting, and indeed it's amplifying, the many structural inequities already prevalent throughout society. And so for the artificial intelligence around us to become better in all senses of that word than it is currently, we as individuals and societies need to insist that it be made better. So the program for today, I'm going to, as previously, turn this over to our junior faculty fellow hosts, who I'll introduce in a moment. We then have roughly an hour of moderated Q&A, where we've taken questions informed by your questions and channeled them into a handful of themes. And then we'll have another half hour towards the end, where there's additional Q&A in a more free form. Right, a couple housekeeping aspects. We encourage you to participate and ask questions using the Q&A feature, please. The questions will be facilitated in turn again by our moderators. And today's event will be posted on the Hariri Institute's YouTube channel. So let me briefly introduce our 2 co-hosts. Jennifer Balakrishnan and Sanaz Mobasseri, both are junior faculty fellows at the Hariri Institute for Computing. If you joined us earlier and saw Elaine and Nsoesie as one of our other hosts, Elaine unfortunately is not feeling well and sent her regrets as being unable to join us. So they were delighted, though, that Sanaz was able to step in and in her place. So Jennifer Balakrishnan is an assistant professor, Department of Math and Statistics at Boston University. Professor Balakrishnan's research is in algorithmic number theory and arithmetic geometry. Sanaz Mobasseri is an assistant professor in management and organizations at BU's Questrom School of Business. And she's an associate director of the Anti-Racist Tech Initiative at the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. Her research investigates how organizational and social networks processes shape gender and race differences amongst employees in the workplace. And she does this by examining the roles of culture, cognition, and emotion in organizations using field experimental and computational research methodologies. So I'm delighted to turn this over to the two of them to get us underway.
All right, well, thank you, Eric, and welcome everyone. Today, we are delighted to have three experts in ethical AI, Sabelo Mhlambi, Timnit Gebru, and Meredith Whittaker, join us for our panel discussion. So let me start by introducing our three panelists. First, we have Sabelo Mhlambi. He's a founder at Bantucracy, a 2018 to 2020 fellow at Harvard's Berkman-Klein Center and the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. His work focuses on decolonial AI and the use of African indigenous philosophy in shaping ethical AI policy and the production of ethical AI in sub-Saharan Africa. Next, we have Timnit Gebru, who co-led the ethical artificial intelligence research team at Google, working to reduce the potential negative impacts of AI. She earned her doctorate under the supervision of Fei Li at Stanford University in 2017 and did a postdoc at Microsoft Research New York in the FATE team. She's also the co-founder of Black in AI, a place for sharing ideas, fostering collaborations, and discussing initiatives to increase the presence of Black people in the field of artificial intelligence. Finally, also joining us today is Meredith Whittaker, the Minderoo Research Professor at New York University, co-founder and faculty director of the AI Now Institute at NYU, and the founder of Google's Open Research Group. Her research and advocacy focuses on the social implications of artificial intelligence and the tech industry responsible for it. Prior to NYU, she worked at Google for over a decade, where she led product and engineering teams and co-founded MLab. As a longtime tech worker, she helped lead labor organizing at Google, driven by the belief that worker power and collective action are necessary to ensure meaningful tech accountability in the context of concentrated industrial power. So welcome, Sabelo, Timnit, and Meredith. We are very pleased to have the three of you with us today. So we'll start with a few questions for the entire panel that, as Eric mentioned, have come from audience members' submissions during your three talks in the lecture series. And then we'll open it up to a general Q&A with the questions submitted by those joining us today. All right, so let's get started. Here's our first question. Technology has long been seen as the solution to problems left and right. Now it's often seen as a key part of the problem. From where should solutions come? Does technology lead or follow? Sabelo, perhaps you could start.
Yes. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Jennifer, Eric, and to everybody in Boston. And it's such a pleasure to join you all, Meredith, Timnit as well. Thank you for having me. In my perspective, I think that we cannot simply find solutions from within technology. Simply because even the technology that we do have today has been shaped by these other systematic inequalities, whether it's racism, or whether it's the legacy of colonization, or other types of discrimination. And so it's and so to try to find solutions within just that alone, I think would be insufficient. And secondly, the problems that we're really facing, they're not necessarily technological in nature. Technology just enables them, or actually increases the gravity of, or maybe suppression or some other type of harm that's been done. I think really the solution there, or maybe a path towards a solution, is to look at these outside factors, or these factors that are sort of that shape how we even produce technology, who gets the funding to create technology, whom is the technology built for, what values are shaping it, what goals are shaping it. If we can address sort of the environment itself around technology and try to, within that environment, consider what I focus a lot on, it tends to be sort of the racialization and also the legacy of colonization. And so, but there are other factors there as well that lend to inequality. But if we can start to identify those different systems and how they contribute to technology, then I think we could change technology for the better, or we could change how we use technology for the better, and use it to improve society. But I don't quite think that the answers necessarily come from technology. In some cases, technology may allow for a societal change, like the Gutenberg press. It allowed more books to be published and so forth. But so that's an example that's been typically used. But then even technology, the power it does afford ends up usually being usurped or taken over by the ruling power class anyways. And so even if there is change that technology can do, it kind of seems difficult that change can, will be sort of, will make the most impact to the people needed the most. It's more likely, I think, especially with how the internet has become, that the people who are already empowered in various means, they'll be the ones who are able to get the most benefit from technology.
Thank you. Timnit, would you like to add some thoughts?
I actually was going to pass it on to Meredith, because Meredith has a lot to say about this topic, and I don't think
Great.
between Sabelo and Meredith, I wouldn't say I'm necessary.
Well, I would still love to hear what you have to say, Timnit. And Sabelo, I loved your points. I don't know that I have that much to add, but I think, where I go with all these questions is I'm like, what are we talking about when we talk about technology? Who defined the problem, right? Like, who is the we who is proclaiming this solutionism, and how, what solutions kind of are, find their way into the kind of common sense kind of bloodstream, and which solutions get consistently ignored, right? Whose solutions, perhaps. And I want, I think if we look at a lot of what we're calling technology, which is, large scale computational technology that, sort of has been increasingly threaded through our core social institutions, especially over the last 20 years, but, accelerating in the last decade. We should look at, like, what are the claims to solutions that are being made and by whom, right? This will solve medicine. This will solve literally mortality, right? We're looking at some pretty wild, hyped up claims on which this infiltration of technology has been sort of justified, I would say, right? And then we look at what the technology is actually doing. It's certainly not solving mortality. It's not solving education. It's not solving, medicine. Whatever these claims that terms like in artificial intelligence and others have allowed to be taken as a given are not, they're not happening, and they're not validated, right? Like, what we're seeing is a predictable replication, amplification, obfuscation of, deeply entrenched systems of racialized inequality that date back to, slavery and beyond, right? This sort of racialization that capitalism requires as a means of naturalizing inequality. So, not to get so deep there, and I'm referencing Ruthie Wilson Gilmore when I say that, just didn't quote it exactly. However, right, we see technology sort of amplifying these things, not solving them, but we see these stories being used to kind of pacify folks or mislead folks into how, kind of they're, shaping their understanding of what technology does, what it might be able to do, whereas when the problems it's solving seem to be like the problem of not having accumulated enough capital to meet, your commitments to your board, or the problem of not, having a, whatever the business problem that is justifying kind of the industrial kind of the tech industry overall. So I think looking at like, what are they reporting to the board, and then what does the marketing say, right? Who gets to define the problem? Like if the problem, I think about wellness programs at work as sort of a potted metaphor here, how everyone is exhausted right now. We are in COVID. It is too much. We are in like irreconcilable contradictions where we're trying to do this work and like no one's taking care of the kids, et cetera. And then we get like an email from our employer, like solve this problem with a mindfulness Zoom, right? And I'm like, no, the problem is like give more money, give more time, right? Like, but see that we're not, like I didn't get to name the problem and the solution, right? Like it's, like within the frame of, continual work forever, within the frame of continual growth and profits forever, that problem has to be solvable without perturbing that frame. And so, anyway, I'm going to stop because I'm going off. But I think again, like, who's tech, who gets to define the problem, and like who gets to validate that it's being solved. And right now, the problem that's being solved is sort of, the core kind of problem of racial capitalism as its incentives, not the problems of structural inequity, climate decimation, other harms.
I was going to say that what just happened with our paper at Google is like a good example of that, because a bunch of people were just allowed to say either that, the reasons they gave us was like, it's not up to par or something. So even if they claimed that they care about like risks and harms, it's their way, right? Like their risks and harms, not from our perspective. So it's, what Meredith was saying, like who gets to frame what their risks and harms are and who gets to, work on the solutions. It's not like a wide variety of people.
Okay, let's move to the second question. Do you think any efforts to diversify, to be more inclusive, to address systemic racism in big tech can change or influence any of the technology that they're developing? And who, as in like what institutions or organizations or stakeholders or groups of people are best positioned to lead those changes, in your opinion?
I can start with that. So I do think that any sort of initiative that tries to funnel money or power to the groups that currently don't have it is in the long, it might look like it only makes a little bit of a difference, but I think in the long run, that's kind of the problem, right? Because many times people see their own problems. They see, they have ideas for what the issues are, how to fix them, whatever, but they don't have access to the same opportunities as other people. And this, there's no meritocracy in Silicon Valley, as you know. It's who you know, and it's all concentrated. You go to certain places, you meet people, you network, etc. So I think that funneling a certain amount of resources or that network power or something to other groups of people, that changes things. And I've seen it happen. So even with Black and AI, our organization, just like a lot of times the research ideas you have or something on how to fix the world, like you yourself can't come up with all of the right, problems, right? But if you give resources to the people who have certain ideas and want to pursue certain directions, I think then that gets their voices heard. And Data for Black Lives is another organization that is working. So Tawana Petty is one, I think she's a national director or something now, and she's working in Detroit to try to get them to ban face surveillance. AGL, of course, Algorithmic Justice League. There's a number, probably others that I'm forgetting. But the thing I think is that it's important to focus so that you're not so broad. Like I think for many times when I'm doing this kind of stuff, I have the issue of like, if we're so broad that we don't make any measurable progress or we can't measure anything that we're doing, then I don't think it's meaningful. But if we're so narrow that our paradigm is too limited, I don't think that's meaningful as well. But then at the same time, there's a limit to what we can do with those kinds of paradigms of just like, being more inclusive. I do think that I wouldn't, say that it doesn't help, because again, like bringing whatever access to power I have, like I went to Stanford, I did whatever, I can't say to someone else that you shouldn't do that, right? I want to give them that same opportunity. But at the same time, I think these gatekeeping mechanisms and institutions as a paradigm, honestly, I think they're like replicating like the aristocracy or so. It's like a different form of, so at some point there needs to be a paradigm shift, right? Of like, and it's not just sort of funneling people to these kind of organizations that are still going to gatekeep. You guys have stuff to say, I'm sure. I've spoken about this to both Sabelo and Meredith at length, so I know they have stuff to say.
Meredith, I can go after you. Oh, okay. Thank you. I sort of see a parallel with the work done by the Zambian economist Dambisa Moyo, and she writes a book called Dead Aid, and the idea that simply giving aid supposedly to the African continent will, improve certain outcomes without, actually seeing the real problems and tying that aid to certain objectives or certain goals. And we've seen the same relationship with the different the strategic, the SAP, the structural adjustment programs that were passed in the 80s and 90s in the African continent, where aid or monetary policy was being given to these countries, and in the actual effect was it led to even more poverty. And so what is the equivalent there when it comes to technology? I think when it comes to technology, the idea then becomes that sometimes we're given these positions and places and posts and funding and this and that, and sometimes there's a risk that one, it might be just a symbolic thing or just a nominal representation without really addressing the real issues. And sometimes even being invited to the table without having real power, then what use is that? And someone once said, well, why can't we even have our own tables? Why do we even need to be on the table in the first place? Why can't we create alternative systems? So I'm using like this, this African parallel to say, to try to like show a connecting thread here that, these same patterns we can also observe them even within how the tech companies work with the idea that, we're not really trying to empower people. We're not really trying to dismantle white supremacy or dismantle racism. We're almost trying to include people into a racist structure and trying to create a controlled space for them to exist in. And so I would rather see aid or funding or whatever the case is, given in such a way, I think Timnit was saying this as well, that empowers people, where like you give the experts that, you give them control, you allow them to have real meaningful power to, make decisions and to, use whatever aid or resources in the best way that they see fit. But it's, it's like the giving of help, whatever help is, or aid or opportunity, should also be accompanied with the giving of power, letting go of power and giving and transferring that power to those who need it.
Yes, I don't have much to add to that, but except that giving power means people sacrificing, and treating this problem as if it's the same people at the top, just kind of making diversity is part of the, part of the like sleight of hand of the diversity and inclusion industry. And I think, yeah, it's gonna mean that people also lose power, and we want that, and we need to recognize that as part of the stakes of what we're doing, and part of why an entire industry has grown up to sort of perform diversity as a powerless set of practices, even if the folks who are doing that work, like people like April Curley and Timnit and many others, do that work brilliantly and are actually effective. You will see the moment the effectiveness is too much for the people who might have to sacrifice. There's a cost there. Yeah.
I see on the chat here, you're saying any thoughts on who is best positioned to lead these types of changes? I mean, I don't really have much to add, but besides what has already been said, but I think it's kind of like, we have to let people who are most affected lead, and kind of respect their knowledge. This goes back to that, so a lot of times, even when we're doing this kind of work, I think we end up kind of empowering the most privileged of whatever group we're hoping to empower. And that's because I don't feel like we respect the knowledge that people have, that's not specifically, like an academic or whatever. There's like a lot of different forms of knowledge that so I think that that's kind of, and so somebody asked me a similar question at this AI for Social Good Summit that was held by the UN in Geneva. And I was just kind of giving an example. I was like, why was this summit held in Geneva? That's already gatekeeping, like everybody that you want to come here. There's discriminatory visa practices. People don't get visas, but people think this is normal. So we're not attacking those kinds of, I mean, these visa practices are extremely discriminatory. I hope we get to a time where we look at it and we say, wow, people did that at that time. It's horrible. Like that's how bad it is, but we just look at it as normal, right? And so it's a really expensive city. It's like, so who are you hoping to get there and talk about AI for social good? So I think, so Meredith was talking about, sacrifice, but I think it's so simple. So like hold this event somewhere else. It's not that complicated, right? But people don't want to do that. So I just think, yeah, I think that people close to the communities and the problems, like local, they should be empowered to lead on this. And so whenever we're talking about, for instance, legislation or regulation in AI, like people even ask me, what regulation do I propose? It's very hard for me to just off the top of my head be like this, but like I can give you some ideas, but there are a lot of people that need to be involved before we can actually have an in-depth conversation about this who are not at the table.
I would like to add to that, Timnit, and thank you so much. I also feel in a weird position myself sometimes when you're expected to then have a prescribed solution which can just work, when the idea is that other people have to be in the table. What I can say definitively is that we need to decenter the conversation from the Western institutions, Western world itself. We need to move that away. That for a fact, I know. We need to move the conversation and allow other people, because as you rightfully say, Timnit, those marginalized folks, they're the experts of their own experiences. They can articulate that, but sometimes we try to articulate things for them using our own voices or Western voices, which might be biased, but allowing people to participate, moving power away, shifting power away, allowing the conversation to sort of happen in these other parts of the world, and learning from that. I think that's a step to towards empowering those people who have been systematically marginalized. But we shouldn't prioritize. I just want to underscore that we just cannot continue to prioritize sort of like this Western narrative, from the same type of thinking and belief systems that have even led us to the situation. We need to value other knowledge systems, other ways of knowing and being and feeling, and see what we can learn from that, and then try to incorporate that.
All right, so I think Timnit already kind of touched on the topic of regulation. So I wanted to ask you all about this. So the editorial board of the Financial Times recently noted that Congress has been considering an Algorithmic Accountability Act, which would compel companies to assess the probable real-world impact of automated decision-making systems. And there's even a case for creating the algorithmic equivalent of the US Food and Drug Administration to pre-approve the use of AI in sensitive areas. What are your thoughts on this?
I would hand it over to Meredith, who's or when this algorithmic accountability stuff was happening in New York, you were involved, right? And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that too. I'm acting like a moderator. Sorry, I'm like encroaching on other people's jobs.
You're doing great.
I also want to hear what you have to say, because I think, yeah, I was on the New York City Automated Decision Systems Task Force, which was like, it was like, come up with a plan for regulating this in the future. And I worked really closely with Rashida Richardson, who's a brilliant policy scholar, sort of on work around that. I think it's a good step, right? It would be good if companies had to account for potential harms. I still look at like who's the agent in that, who has agency within that, and it's companies, right? And it's companies kind of guesstimating the harms in a similar, and it makes me uneasy in a similar way that the kind of guesstimating the benefits makes me uneasy, because look where we are with all of that. And so I think there are real questions about, again, who gets to affirm and validate, the benefits or the harms. And particularly, I'm particularly concerned about this because in the case of a lot of these AI systems, you're looking at a sort of chain of title that goes from a big company who's maybe licensing a model as a service to an institution like a government or another third-party business who's then sort of packaging that for use on a subject population. And that subject population may have no idea that an algorithm is being employed in certain determinations. So you're like, there's a real significant, to use a computation, like air gap between the people who are sort of guesstimating these problems and their potential remediations and the people who are experiencing the harms or the implications that aren't harmful. And this is actually structural, right? Like a lot of these contracts between a business that's licensing an AI model for use on a subject population and the big tech company that's providing that model or that infrastructure, the contracts themselves have an NDA that stipulates you can't talk about the contract, right? So like we're gonna have, what that means is we're gonna have to unravel a lot of this structurally before we can even get to a point where legislation like that wouldn't just mean like, okay, Google is forced to hire 1,100 more policy folks to sort of come up with interpretations of this law that then like mitigate liability, and they write estimates about what the potential harms probably are, and they do some disparate impact testing, like hire Kathy O'Neill or someone to come on in and do that. But like ultimately it can still be used to exploit workers, it can still be used for means testing, it can still be used for these sort of to enforce structural inequities, exploitation, and oppression in ways that go beyond sort of the narrow definitions that these companies will certainly hew to if a rule like that goes in place, and then likely the subject population still won't have a say. So we need bigger changes.
I was also going to ask Sabelo, because we had this conversation about, I guess, like tech companies not paying any taxes in African countries, for instance, and like you were having some suggestions, right? Like that you wanted to take to the EU, to the African Union. I'm wondering if you could, I'm sorry, if you can tell us more about that.
If they're listening. No, I'm just kidding. Yes. I mean, so it's a very problematic case, Timnit, and thank you for bringing that up. But let me just preface this by first saying this. I think we do need legislation, but I think we also have to keep the fire burning under these people, because what other interests might be able to even influence if such a board was created to manage algorithms and so forth. And we've seen in the past where government structures have been used again to oppress people and so forth. So yes, we need the legislation, and I think a system to continue exerting the right amount of pressure. So for people to continue participating in civic government and trying to bring about societal change. The issue I find quite difficult with sub-Saharan Africa, at least when it comes to legislation or legislating these usually foreign big tech companies, them, Google's, Facebook, and Twitter, and and so forth is that it doesn't appear that they're paying their fair share of taxes within the continent. Now, you can imagine, a situation where you have some of the least developed economies in the world, and you have the highest cost of the internet is in the African continent. And it seems that, in fact, what the big tech companies are doing, they're actually exploiting that. They're now building their own infrastructure, the internet backbones and different hardware that they're placing around all over the continent, free Wi-Fi stations. And then you find as well how telecom companies are like companies like, for example, Facebook with the free basic program, how they've made their service essentially free in most of this, in like at least 33 countries last time I checked. And what this does then to the local ecosystem, how it might even prevent competition. If data is so expensive, but then Facebook is free, why would people use my app, which requires data, which is expensive? They can easily go to a large company that's well funded. So I think there needs to be legislation at the very least to then try to give back the wealth that was, that's generated and that's extracted from the users, African users using those platforms, and to tax these companies appropriately. I think Facebook pays around 14% tax in India, somewhere around that figure, but it's unclear if they even pay that in any African country. And only Nigeria and Kenya, I think, have legislation that enables them to even begin taxing those companies. And it's unclear that they even, I don't think they've even progressed that far to even begin doing so. But I think we need legislation, not so much because if for any reason, just I think we need the legislation to then try to create alternative solutions within the continent and to try to create meaningful competition, to allow for local systems to emerge, but not to be in a place where, for example, where the African continent is always sort of a receiver of the finished goods that are designed in the Western world, where the data is extracted, the raw materials, and then you get back the finished goods, which displaces the local markets, right? We've seen this formula happening all over, right? In Mexico with the Mobasseri program, how they destroy the agriculture industry of Mexico, leading to the whole, many, Mexican farmers having to work in the United States. So that way of displacing local solutions, displacing markets, I think we need legislation to be able to identify that pattern and see it as it's happening, and then try to stop it, and then allow for healthy alternatives or healthy ecosystems to emerge. Now, of course, we still, I think, just like anywhere, we would still need to keep the fire burning and put the pressure on the local governments, on the local tech companies themselves to, act in a ethical manner and in a way that actually works for the people in the community, being aware that there are the inequalities that do happen elsewhere, and so we'll still need to be involved as well. But I think we do definitely need legislation to cover a whole wide of ideas besides algorithmic accountability, but even also legislation that allows the fairly taxes these big tech companies.
I think Safia also talks about it in the US context, right? She talks about how in California, public institutions are starved because a lot of tech companies are not really paying their fair share of taxes. And so imagine if they, paid a lot of taxes so that we could actually fund our public school system. So not being from the US, I still don't understand how the public school system funding, I didn't grow up here, so the whole tying it to property tax and neighborhoods and stuff sounds crazy to me, just that idea itself. But how all of these public institutions are constantly starved, for money, and tech companies are not really paying their fair share of taxes. So just even simple things like that could go a long way.
Can I just do a quick, just a tiny follow-up on that? And it's quite interesting because I think now what we're observing in the startup world is that many startups want to be bought out by Google or Facebook or whatever the big company is. And so we're seeing, this concentration of power. And so at the same time, these big tech companies might not be giving their fair share in California, in the global South. And so it's another thing I think that needs to be urgently addressed, because the more powerful these companies grow, I think then the more harm they're able to enact because of their size, because of their scale, because of their economic power. So maybe even one way to try to deal with the level of harm maybe might be to prevent these companies to acquire so much power through evading taxes, or evading some type of policy or some type of measures.
Just one quick point on that, like plus 1,000, and I think we can look to the FTC and the incoming commissioners to see if they're interested in using their kind of powers over mergers there. But we also should look at the fact that most startups are running on big tech, right? So they're running on AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, like in that order of dominance, and then a handful of others at like the tail end. But this is the dependencies of the entire startup ecology and the university research ecology is on these big tech companies. So even if we're talking about things like there's this whole discourse that's a bit fabricated around democratizing AI research, and one of the ways they're trying to do that is through kind of a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act that would create a public cloud, right? And everyone's like, that's, it's going to be great. There's a commission that's going to, talk about it, and probably Eric Schmidt will be on that, right? But when you look at what that actually means, that means extending Google or Amazon in some way that is a bit more accessible to the public, right? So I think we need to be really clear about like how deep this concentration of power goes, and the fact that a lot of these systems are not imaginable without that concentration of power. So like our imaginative horizon needs to kind of expand to be like, okay, well then what else could we build if our objective function is dismantling that concentration of power and reparative dismantling.
I think another, well, I don't know, do you guys want to move on? I was gonna say one thing. So Meredith was saying to touch on like impacting and protecting critical research and intellectual freedom. So that's very related to what just happened in our team. And the reason I was not just, I didn't just say, okay, let's just retract this paper, was because there was ramifications. It wasn't just about this one paper for me. And so I wasn't even, so at Google, I was, I was ordered to retract a particular paper, right? And so, and I had even said, I am willing to retract the paper if we discuss certain things, right? Because I was much more worried about the whole process and the ramifications for the research that our team does, and especially the critical research that some of the people we hired recently just to specifically do that type of research, what those ramifications would be. And so there's two things, like on the one hand, because we don't have so much funding for a lot of this a lot of research in AI in general, we do have funding, but like the amount of money that industry is pumping into it, it's very different from the amount of money, like let's say the NSF is pumping into it, right? Maybe DARPA, but like we don't have some this huge body of funding for it. So I think it's still good to encourage companies to contribute to the open, research, because there's a lot of companies that just don't publish. It's all secret, and so they just don't publish at all. So I think it's still important to like kind of incentivize them to still publish, etc. But then at the same time, if that just becomes propaganda and it's not research, and it paints a very distorted view of what the harms and risks are, that's not really research output, right? Like it becomes more propaganda. Even if you don't touch, even if the lawyers are not touching all of the research, but they're like suppressing this and not suppressing this, that still becomes more propaganda, right? So I think we need to have legislation or some sort of oversight and to figure out how to protect workers in these places that are doing this kind of critical research. I really do think, I don't think the answer is to just move all of this out always, completely have no type of this kind of work in big tech companies. I think that, and I think like independent bodies need to be there, but I don't think the answer is just move all the researchers out always, and so you don't do any of this kind of work. I think we need to have some sort of whistleblower protection, or maybe we already have these laws, but they need to be strengthened. it's very connected to all of the labor laws that we're talking about that we want to be strengthened, right? We need to have stronger anti-discrimination laws, because what does it mean for people to be doing this kind of critical work if the only people who can do it are the ones who are not discriminated against, right? So we need to have stronger anti-discrimination laws, and we need to have some sort of oversight. And I think the academic institutions and conferences and all these bodies can play a role, right, in instituting some of these. I mean, I don't think that's at all like what we need laws, actual laws, but I'm saying to supplement these conferences, academic institutions can still have some policies. For instance, there was just this article by Reuters about, there were a series of articles about some processes that Google was engaged in during the research publication approval process. One of them was talking about how lawyers were editing the paper, I mean, like heavily editing the paper in very, very concerning ways. And so there needs to be a flag for that type of thing in an academic conference. So perhaps, companies can submit their whatever policies they have for, to these conferences so that we know, or something like that, right? But I think the current landscape is going to start to be more and more propaganda. And I know a lot of people had written about this already, about like big tech and big tobacco and fossil fuel industry, and how they were doing this and how they were influencing research in this way. So I think we can learn from that history as well to try to see what a particular way forward is.
Oh, thank you so much, Timnit. I wanted to just add a little bit, just a tiny bit on that question, on this sort of protected research or alternative infrastructure, maybe like a data commons or something of that sort, to try to sort of like move away from, and maybe not entirely is what Timnit is saying, but to try to have alternative systems. This is a question that we've been dealing with, a lot of us within the largest NLP community in the African continent, Masakana, because for example, this is a use case that we have, right? We're collecting this data on languages, and we think it could be useful. And we see that if we make it public, it would be useful. But then we're also, especially as Africans, we're aware of the extreme interest that would come in and probably take over that data and use it to create products and then commodify to us as well, or use it to advertise to us, or build better algorithms to better surveil us, or to better shift our preferences, or to mold them in some way. And so we're faced with this sort of like difficult situation in that, what exactly do we make available? And how do we protect that such that it can be used in a way that actually builds the local ecosystem where we can build local solutions, rather than enabling a big company to come and say, oh, thank you for doing the hard work for us. Now we'll just take that and we'll build alternative systems. And so it's an ongoing question. And so one answer that people have tried is to maybe, for example, a data set was created, or there's a data set being created on like academic papers. And the idea is that, well, how much harm, I guess, can come from building systems around academic papers in local languages. And, it's definitely not a perfect solution, but it just kind of describes this difficult position, which we face a lot of times when we don't have the infrastructure or the necessary funding or the tools to protect us, to protect us to do the work that we want to do for our communities and for our societies.
Thank you. I realize we've mismanaged time, so I only have 7 minutes left before we open it up. I think this next question you guys have actually spoken to a lot, so I will expand it a bit. Are there other social and economic mechanisms that we can make use of to better ensure that those developing technology are held accountable for its impact? And I also want to amplify something Meredith said earlier about shifting power, meaning losing power for those who have it, and invite you to think about or reflect on the obstacles we can anticipate, and if you've thought about strategies to overcome that from aversive reactions to losing power.
Sabelo, why don't you go?
Sanaz, I think you're definitely right. We've touched upon on different measures that we can use, to try to distribute the power around. And, there will always be more that we can do. And, something that I keep on going back to is just this idea of having alternative systems in place. Ways to get out, because to successfully resist when we don't have any viable options, it sort of makes it kind of difficult. Meredith already highlighted just how deep this is. Even my startup is hosted on these big tech companies, and so we use the technology, but while being aware of some of the practices, and we're placed sometimes in such difficult positions. But still, I just cannot find a way out of this without organizing. And the movement that I would like to highlight is that I draw inspiration from, that's happening now, is this decolonial AI movement. The idea that we can see sort of these colonial practices from the past, how they've been developed over time, and how they're still being used today to still treat, to still marginalize people who have already been historically marginalized. Something that came to my attention more recently was, especially with the idea of facial recognition technology, was that if we trace the idea of creating these statistical tools to try to identify people for the purpose of maybe surveillance or control, we find that this technology was really advanced and developed in South Africa by Francis Galton, who wanted to find a way to monitor the Black South Africans, right, and to keep tabs on them, to keep track of them, and to control the movement. And so him and his associate back in the UK, they pioneered different statistical methods for correlation, inference, and the bell curve, and so forth, to try to manage populations. And so I think realizing that some of these tools we have today, were developed anyways to try to project to take an amount of data and to try to project it to sort of to a large audience, and then use that data to try to shape something about those people, shape policy, to control them, how they move, where they are, where they stay. And so so we still see even today, now we're able to do much more with the power of artificial intelligence. And in some ways, we can still find that pattern being used, to sort of use data to try to control people, and even the use of identification. I want to end that answer with an anecdote. This idea of surveillance is so interesting to me because so my family is Zimbabwean, South African, and when they talk about I'm getting an ID, right? I'm getting a certificate or an ID. They always say I'm getting my thumb. It's like they use the word for thumb to talk about an identification, a photo, and that's because since the early 1900s they became used to this idea of biometric identification to give you access to every aspect of life. And so we can see then that how this develops, has continued so on today. So I bring that up to say that when we then see the racist policies and the colonial policies that have shaped, even that were at the very beginning of some of these tools, then it might inspire us then to find decolonial ways, anti-racist ways to try to deal with these with the negative effects of technology. And so one way that right now I really resonate with, again, is decolonial, finding inspiration from movements of resistance around the world, movements of anti-colonial resistance that we've witnessed, and trying to learn lessons from those movements and seeing, you know, where do they fail, how do they succeed, and trying to learn from people who have been resisting for, you know, for centuries, and then bringing that knowledge to our practical work and trying to use that in some ways. So as we don't have to always reinvent the wheel, but we can sort of take from, you know, our ancestors, take from our predecessors, and use that to fight against this technology.
All right, so slightly shifting gears, we received a number of questions along these lines. Does a career pathway already exist to become an ethical AI researcher? And if not, what are the best steps we can take now? And what advice would you give to students interested in pursuing AI research?
Oh man, I can give a short, so one thing I've noticed, so in my own work, there's been, I would say, different strains, just different lines of it. There's been ones that are just not controversial in the sense that, you know, I would work on it from an engineering perspective because I was an engineer. I'm like, oh, I want this as an engineer. And, you know, people are like, yeah, sure, let's do this. It's a matter of operationalizing something, etc. But then a lot of times, all the other work has resulted in some sort of very stressful, very, you know, just like situation. So for instance, when Joy led Gender Shades, she started working on it in 2015. And this work came out, it was very stressful. You know, it was very stressful for a number of reasons. Some people were doubting it, but like, you know, it can't be because of, you know, skin tone, it can't be because of this, that, whatever. I don't know. They were doubting it. Their follow-up work came out. Amazon VPs were trying to discredit it, and they were extremely stressed out. Her and Deb, extremely stressed out, talking about dropping out and this and that. And so I spent like a whole month with Meg kind of assembling a rebuttal and all that. Then, you know, we write this paper and I'm fired, and, you know, Meg is fired and our team is in shambles. So it feels to me that, like, you know, we're at this, and then, you know, Meredith did walked the walk, right? She wasn't just writing papers and stuff. She like actually was walking the walk at Google, and she got pushed out, right? So this is not nice to say in an answer to a question about like ethical path towards ethical AI research. So what I'm saying is that I feel this work is very intertwined, I think, with labor movements and social movements. And I don't think you can separate them out neatly. And so I think you want to go into it, you know, thinking that way, because otherwise I think it's possible to do more harm, because it's possible to do harm while using this work to advance your career, while the other people are fighting for their own rights, and they're doubly being harmed because they're being harmed by the technology, and they're not writing the papers that would advance their career, and they're out there fighting in the streets. And actually, Meg Mitchell and Ben Hutchinson had written this paper called 50 Years of Test Unfairness that talks about in the 60s, a similar type of dynamic was happening. There were people doing research in this area and having the similar kinds of conversations about fairness metrics and this and that, because of standardized testing and its effects and its impacts on certain groups of people. And you can see who so like there are people who are called, you know, the most dangerous academics in the US because they were like marching with the students. The two other people they talked about were actually killed in the end, you know, and so they were working on this with in tandem with the social movements that they were trying to advance. And so I think that's the one advice that I want to give, is that this work is tied to those movements and the social movements, labor movements, etc. And don't try to untie it. And as a student, you have power to organize, you have power to change things. And I will let like my co-panelists who have a lot more experience with that touch on that. But and I think the other thing is you should bring your whole self to it. You should bring your background, whatever you studied before, whether it's history or art or anthropology or you know, any of the engineering fields. There's a lot that you can contribute, whatever your background is. And so you should, you know, follow some of these organizations, like AI Now is one. Yeah, there's many organizations that touch on this topic and put out like works and put out and kind of help give visibility to other researchers in this area. So you can start following those organizations. And so I think that's just kind of, that would be the advice that I would give.
I can only say a little bit on that. I don't think in the past few years the path has been clear. It's been mostly activists who have been pushing this field, this work on ethical AI. I do know that, for example, when I first joined Black in AI in 2017, I think, and I was at one of the NeurIPS conferences. You know, having such a community, you know, also enabled me to do the work that I'm even doing now in the, you know, in the first place. And so, while change can be done by anyone at any moment, any age, and so forth, a lot of the change that has happened, at least if I use my decolonial lens and sort of study that, we've seen a lot of number of student movements, or you know, these new researchers, academics with, you know, different ideas and different perspectives, and so what I'm trying to say really then is that a sure path doesn't have to be always there. I think what matters the most is the spirit of activism, the spirit of organizing, the spirit of reaching out and building community and talking about these ideas. Because the more you talk about them, you might end up realizing that there are other people like yourself, and then you organize and then you build, and then you're able to form a strong, formidable community. But I do realize that a number of universities are now mixing philosophy and computer science, are trying to merge those two in some ways to maybe create new paths where students can, in the future, either have more ethical knowledge as they build technology, or maybe even participate in public interest technology. But I don't think it's a fully clear set path on how someone gets to that level. It's sort of, in my own experience, it's been like mixing here and mixing there, and bringing, like what Timnit was saying, your whole being to the conversation.
Thank you. I want to build on that, and I really loved both of those points. I think, you know, by far the most effective, impactful work I've done on, like, quote unquote AI ethics is, you know, organizing against Maven at Google, right? You know, like sort of bringing organizing to the table as a tool for accountability and sort of, you know, trying to gain more power over these decisions and surface publicly significant determinations that are made in secret at tech companies. I think that said, it's not a, you know, there's a modality in organizing in social movements that is, you know, like it needs to be collective. It needs to be solidaristic. And some of the work there is like an actual kind of, you know, it's opposed to a lot of the incentives and a lot of the individualistic ways in which both academia and tech work sort of view people as sort of, you know, positions within a hierarchy where you're in implicit competition with everyone around you. So it does, you know, it requires emotional work as well, like kind of breaking down your sense of self within a hierarchy and your sense of competition with your, you know, your friends and your colleagues, and beginning to sort of understand yourselves as like part of something together and do kind of, you know, care work with each other. And, you know, like I'm, you know, that's a very serious part of it, and not, you know, it's not something you can just do alone. Like, I am an activist, here it is, like they have the power, right? So what we're talking about when we talk about building power, building kind of movements, organizing, is like also committing to that work and committing to each other, and sort of replacing your sense of self as a person like climbing a ladder with a sense of self that is in community with people and sort of receptive to doing that long-term work. And I think like that's actually, you know, even doing that is sort of like in itself a radical transformation within environments that are structured to prevent that, right? And there's a whole history of how they're structured to prevent that. But I think that's, you know, thinking about bringing your whole self there and thinking then about how do you do it together, right? How do you, you know, build that power so you can succeed, so it's not, you know, we don't need more martyrs, right? We need movements that are building power and that are, you know, where we're protecting each other and, you know, able to fight these fights.
Thank you, guys. We're getting some great questions in the chat that we're trying to organize. I'm going to read two that go together but are slightly different. There's a question that says, how might we reduce the reverence that prospective employees have for these companies? The vast majority of our students want to go work for one of the big five, or as Meredith says, be an entrepreneur whose company is acquired by one of these companies. And it's their ability to attract top talent that keeps these companies dominant. And another related question about education, as an educator in computing and with responsibility for promoting ethical computing, where are the best resources available to help me get different voices in the materials we use for education?
Sabelo.
You're so gracious, Timnit. I saw a paper, I think a news article, maybe 2 years ago, which I think it was around the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the elections. And they had shown that the number of Facebook employees from the top CS universities was actually declining. And so to me, indicating that public pressure on a company, whether it's, you know, highlighting the moral failures, the ethical failures, it does have an impact in some ways to attracting top talent, because some people might be more driven in some ways with sort of having a clean ethical conscience, or whatever the case is, than to work for these big companies. And so it may not, you know, really change the whole industry entirely, but there has been shown a dip when we begin to highlight these issues. So I think putting public pressure does help, and it's a much harder question. If we remove that, you know, the putting public pressure onto these companies, I think it's really hard then to also try to dissuade the students from going to those big tech companies, because the whole tech culture is built around these tech companies. We celebrate being a unicorn. We celebrate being the young billionaire. You know, the environment tends to create that because it's useful for this economy or for the goals of whoever, you know, might be benefiting from such a structure. So it's just you know, it's, besides approaching this from an ethical perspective, highlighting how this might be harmful for human rights, how it might be harmful for democracy, how it might be harmful for the environment, how even cloud computing or blockchain technology, for example, is harmful to the environment itself, and then tapping into the interests that the students have. You know, they're concerned for the globe, they're concerned for good governance, they're concerned for their neighbors, you know, they're concerned for marginalized communities. Tapping into that might be also a way to bring change.
I don't really have much more to add to that.
All right, well, thank you, Sabelo. What question for all of you, what gives you all the most hope for the future?
The students, I think every time undergraduate students, I just feel like they're always so ahead. I always get surprised by Like right now, they started a Recruit Me Not campaign, hashtag Recruit Me Not. So, oh, I was gonna write it to panelists and attendees. Let's see. So that kind of stuff, and like seeing the difference between them and the people who've been at institutions for a long time, I see like the shift in thinking, I think. And so for me, that's sort of what gives me hope. And I think like maybe that we're sort of connecting, like we're having global networks of people with similar kind of thought processes. And so we're not super isolated from each other. That sort of gives me hope. Yeah, I think that's the, those are kind of maybe the two things I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the students and the young people and how quickly they get and teach me about a lot of these issues, which, I came out of Google and I would, it was just like banging your head against a brick wall to talk to some guy who became a like hyper millionaire in 2001, right? Like, and you're just trying to describe, like racism is real, right? And then I go into these classrooms and like the young people just like get it, right? And they're like, excuse me, Professor Whittaker, here's a question you may not have thought, or like an angle, like what about disability, right? Like there's a way in which I think people are really doing this sort of capacious connecting of different issues and understanding them as sort of a fabric and not, siloed in a way that is not productive, which, I'm seeing in particularly the abolitionist movement, which I'm learning so much from over the last number of years, and the willingness to sit with problems that don't feel tractable and like, work on them together. So I don't, to cite Gramsci, an optimist of the will, a pessimist of the intellect, right? Like I'm always going to fight. And I do see, the world in a state that is very difficult to solutioneer my way out of. But when I sit with these, communities, or when I learn from like young people who, already just like naturally gender is a construct, right? I'm like, what, like that was something I learned over like a year in college as an old person, right? And it's just like, it's like the air they breathe. And it gives me hope that there are sort of paradigm shifts that I can then follow that are happening at that level, and that there are, imaginative capacities that are being built by folks that can kind of like refigure the world we're in. And I want to, Sabelo's sort of comment about different ways of knowing, about, like letting people with different ways of knowing lead a building of a healthier world is something that, I'm not going to be on the front lines of, but I want to be like supporting them, right? Like if they're running the marathon, I want to be handing out the water, right? And just sort of being there for those efforts, because I do feel a lot of hope when I'm in those rooms or when I'm confronted with like that new kind of knowledge.
Thank you for that. I feel the most hope too when I'm at events like this, and that there are people in the audience who care about these ideas, and that my panelists have done such amazing work, and so you see people also pushing the fight and leading the fight, and so knowing that there is this solidarity happening. So I do feel a lot of strength in that, in this group unity, in this solidarity, in that there's power movements happening. I also draw hope lastly on what Kwame Nkrumah I guess prophesied or described will be the outcome of such systems, and that he said ultimately they have to collapse because they're untenable. What will eventually happen is you will have dissent and discontent back home, and also have the same feelings globally, for example, in the global south. And so when that point of unison or unity, when both worlds realize that it's actually, we have a common issue here, a common problem, and we need to directly deal with this, and then we'll be able to use to take back our power as civilians, as society, and demand better. And so I think meeting like this helps to sort of build those common points and show that this is not an isolated thing happening for example, in the United States. It's also here in Europe. It's in the global South. It's happening in this type of ways. There's a historic patterns. They're not new. So seeing that this is, very thoughtful and connected and planned, and then trying to highlight those points of connection. For me, that gives me hope, because I think once we reach a critical mass, I don't know what that even means, like what percentage of the society has to reach such a point. But I think there's a level of involvement and collaboration that we can use to really put a dent onto what's happening right now. So that gives me hope that this work is happening, and that there will always be people. The younger generation is what Meredith was saying. The younger students who have these new ideas, and then also seeing the work that's been done so well, by my co-panelists and by other researchers as well, and just the community attending here. It gives me a lot of hope.
I have to say that when I departed, I mean, there's a lot of words to be used now. I got fired, but there's a lot of words they use: departed and, resigned and whatever. Google, there were a lot of people organizing on my behalf, and I had never even met them. Like, I didn't know, there were the fired five from who were fired for Thanksgiving. There's Claire and Meredith, and there's just a number of other people. And that's really amazing to see that type of solidarity. And also it helps me understand how, even when you don't see the full extent of what you want to change from one specific instance. So for instance, the Google walkout or the following things, they all build on each other. And each thing that you do in the past is enabling people in the future to have a different kind of paradigm on how to organize, or what to accept and what not to accept, right? And so I think we're still making progress, even if it doesn't seem like we might be. I hope. I don't know. I have to feel that way. I think we are. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really powerful. And we have some great questions, but it feels so much better to end on that note. The Q&A around what gives you hope. I think I was anticipating that it might, these conversations, this topic is hard and it's taxing and difficult to get together, and you're probably getting bombarded with requests to talk about the same thing over and over again. But we really appreciate that you did that with us today and when you gave your talks, because it was really impactful for our community. We have a few minutes left before we close, and I don't know if there's any closing remarks that each of you want to leave us with. We figured that might be better than ending on a question about corporate taxation. Might lose some of the momentum we built.
I can go. I mean, I don't have much to say beyond what we said in the last hour and a half, basically. But I think that maybe people might understand that they can change, that they have agency. So in many, when I was even working with leaders in our company at Google, right? A lot of leaders would just follow orders and act like they don't have any agency. It's very interesting. It's because we have a system that makes you feel that way, that has certain norms, and if you just go a little bit outside of those norms, you're kind of shamed into not doing it or something like that. But I saw people realizing the agency that they have, and so I think that people have different amounts of privilege, but a certain amount of agency, especially when they collectively organize. So I think we should all just remember that. I mean, we can't change everything in the world, but we can change a little. We can try to change something locally that might have ripple effects, because I mean, you have to focus, right? Otherwise, I mean, if we just try to boil the ocean, it's not gonna work. So I think that's the only thing I have to say is just we're not taught to critically examine so many norms that we just grow up thinking are fine. And then the moment you do, you might start to realize that you have some amount of agency. And I think that's most important to realize in these kinds of situations.
Timnit said. I guess one thing I can sort of building on my talk last week, sort of, the threat to critical research, which Timnit has certainly discussed and lived. I think, I'm also looking for ways to build stronger connections to each other as critical researchers and people in communities who are, building their own expertise, pushing against these systems and understanding the way they work on, on people, and I think, like I'm one of the things I'm now thinking about all the time is like, how do we build real solidarity as researchers sort of beyond the boundaries of the workplace or, the academic institution, with a kind of strategic eye, recognizing that like when this work, when speaking these truths, when answering questions that matter to, people opposed to this kind of power, when doing this and when doing this effectively over time, you're challenging that power, and the way power reacts when challenged, we have a pretty clear understanding of that. I think, what Timnit went through is, and her team, like that, there it is. There is one example among way too many. So how do we like begin to incorporate that knowledge into this work so that we're ready to protect each other and to stand up for each other as folks doing this work, and we're ready to, and we're like a bit less surprised when it happens. And I think that, like, again, that's going to take preserving our histories, that's going to take working more closely with each other, that's going to take, certain forms that I certainly can't just imagine right now. But I think it's going to be really important, in addition to legislation, in addition to other modes of sort of protecting this work and this space for dissent, to sort of recognize the stakes here and the playbook that we're up against.
Yeah, my closing remarks or ideas really revolve on that. I think the greatest power is when we're united, when we can collaborate and cooperate together. And I think that's something I definitely want to do more, and to be a resource for anyone, and to just really give and work towards that common good. For people listening to this, watching this, my fellow panelists, I think it's that idea of when we unite, amazing things happen. And I draw that from the Ubuntu philosophy, which I write about a lot, which is the idea that it is through working for the better good for each other, enriching each other's humanity, and working towards and working with each other for each other, that we can overcome anything. And so with that in mind, truly that nothing is impossible, as long as we can, we can do anything together, we can overcome anything together. I think a new movie just came out, a Black Panther movie about Freddie Hampton, who was assassinated at 21 in Chicago. And I believe he should say something as well, that it's like this people power, that working together, that, this revolution, it cannot be stopped. And so the more we begin to realize that through these conversations and working for the good of each other, despite the many difficulties that come along with that type of work, I think we can end up making the progress that we can. And it's not impossible, it's doable. And I'm just glad just to even be part of this conversation, and to just even have my moment in time to share these ideas. And I'm looking forward for more other people engaging and joining in, and really to then work towards that future which we so desperately need and so desperately want.
That's the best closing note to end on, right?
Okay. I want to maybe just wrap us up here then. And first of all, really thank our panelists for sharing your thoughts and your experiences, and I think most importantly, how we ended here, your hopes. We're really grateful to you for the time and energy that you were devoting to this in general, of course, but also taking a smidgen of that and sharing it with us here and with our audience. I want to remind people that if you liked what we had here, we have another distinguished speaker series coming up in the late spring, so please do keep an eye out for that. Obviously, we're pivoting in topics. This will be moving towards where machine learning and model-rich domains meet. I want to also thank Professors Balakrishnan and Mobasseri for moderating this event. This was fantastic. Very much appreciate their efforts on this. And a big shout out to our staff. Catherine D'Angelo and Gina Mantica have done an amazing job in setting up this entire series and the program and events angle and on the communication side as well. We will be posting this to our YouTube channel. So if you want to review this again, or you only caught part of it or whatnot, you should be able to get it again. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you for our hosts, and we hope to see you soon.